do business with people they like. And so building those relationships and building a community feel where people feel, hey, I need some help.
Nothing beats getting in a room together and just throwing stuff up on a whiteboard and seeing what sticks and what slowly slides off as you investigate it further.
It's one thing to be able to say, hey, we know what the issues are. It's something entirely different to be able to say, and here's what the really smart CEOs are doing about it.
This episode, this chat is about 30 years in the making. That's how long I've known Neil Henderson. I was lucky enough to know when he kicked off his career in broadcasting at the age of 15 and then becoming at 16 the youngest television commentator in the UK for the BBC. He went on to work with ITN, Sky Sports and Sky News. And then in 2006, he moved into communications, working on brand, reputation and crisis communication for leading FTSE 100 and FTSE 500 companies, including Samsung, McDonald's, Nintendo, MasterCard, Pfizer. You get the drift. He's been there and done it. And then he's also delivered media and presentation training for over 2,000 leaders globally. So no pressure on me today. For the past 7 years, he's lived and worked in Switzerland. Look, we talk about a whole lot of things, especially around kind of corporate culture, how it's changed, and also some of the leaders that we've both worked under. Neil shared some experience of working with some really tough leaders, especially within broadcasting, where there was no inch given. We talked about generational shifts and AI in the workplace. And it was really interesting. Neil's take is that relationships cannot be replaced by AI, but it definitely has a place for us. We also spoke about some of the bigger topics like addressing misinformation. How do you deal with media inquiries when things aren't quite going right? How do you make sure that, maybe a CEO or a board member has got the right information to make the right decision when a camera or a microphone's pushed in front of them? And finally, we talk about career development, networking, the importance of building a network and being resilient and kind of curious to everything that's happening around. So let's kick right into it, where Neil and I start off by reminiscing. Neil, it's really good to see you. It's been a while.
It has indeed. And I think we go back to 1990, 1991 in Scotland when we were still broadcasting on telephones. So that's how long ago it was. And you're in Sydney, I'm in Switzerland, so I'm in near Geneva. I've been in Switzerland for 7 years. So it's been a really interesting 3 decades, because we started in Scotland and moved all over the UK and then into Europe and beyond. So it's great to be invited to join you.
So how's Switzerland?
Switzerland is an interesting country. So, it has its neutrality, but also it's a country of 4 seasons of weather, but also 4 different types of culture. I used to live in Zurich, on the Zurich side, which was German-speaking mainly, which 98% of Switzerland is German-speaking, Swiss German. And I recently moved to the French side, and it really is culturally different language, different food, different personality of people. And when people look at Switzerland, they think of cheese and chocolate and the Alps, but actually it really is an economic powerhouse in terms of manufacturing. So if you think of your car, most of the parts of your car will have been made here in Switzerland, which not a lot of people know. But also people talk about German efficiency, but actually Swiss efficiency, that's the most important thing in Europe, because actually everything does run on time.
And now I'm curious, was that a big adjustment, moving to somewhere as efficient or maybe as kind of process driven as Switzerland then?
It can be, because I think that when you're dealing with the different parts of the country, you imagine the French, people have a stereotype of the French, they have a stereotype of Italians, and they have a stereotype of Germans. And it does kind of work in this country. There is levels of bureaucracy, but the bureaucracy here is not red tape. It's almost drilled into you in schools here. So in the Swiss system, accuracy is really important. You know, you're marked down if you don't draw in a straight line or you don't cut in a straight line. So when you go into shops and when you apply for, you know, an apartment or whatever, there is Swiss accuracy and attention to detail. So it's not bureaucracy as such. It's just part of the culture, and it's kind of drilled into people.
Well, I think we discussed with you before that we do a lot of work here with lots of different cultures. Sydney's a hotbed for culture, but certainly across even Asia. I'm curious, how does that set the Swiss apart? I mean, we go straight into talk about culture in a country, but I'm just thinking about how does it set the Swiss apart when we're talking about at a business level?
Yeah, I think in business, sometimes that accuracy and attention to detail can hold them back.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at this, you know, it's a consensus approach to business, and I think, you know, when you've got a hierarchical structure in place, like in Germany and Austria to a certain extent as well, sometimes it's difficult to make those really key decisions quickly, because you have to get everyone in a room and agree. Whereas in the UK system, or in France and you know, other countries in Europe, the Nordics particularly, it's a lot easier to get stuff done. Which I think, if you look at the Swiss economy and if you look at all of the big businesses in Switzerland, in the main, they're led by non-Swiss chief executives. And that's not talking down the Swiss people or the training or the education. But I think that Nestle, Zurich, Novartis, you know, my company, Insight, you know, all of these companies are led by non-Swiss people. And I think if you were to look at Scotland as a comparison, would people really be happy with Standard Life or Scottish and Newcastle or some of the whiskey brands being led by Germans or you know, people not from Scotland? I think they would struggle with that. But I think the Swiss, they just kind of brush it off. It's just part of their society and economy. That, you know, what we're seeing at the moment is how Europe is moving to the far right and they're being anti-immigrant. But actually, Switzerland knows that, you know, 60% of the work done here is done by non-Swiss people, you know, on various levels. And they get that their economy wouldn't be thriving and inflation wouldn't be low without those people coming into the country. So I think they're comfortable with that. Compared to their neighbours in Germany and Austria, they don't have the same problems here that they have in those countries.
I'm curious with what you've just said. Obviously, I've been out of Europe for a while, but I kind of know that company leaders here and certainly in the US, it wouldn't necessarily be a problem if you went kind of from that country, or you went a national. You think that's still an issue in certain places?
Yeah, I think so. Particularly in Germany. You know, if you look at Germany, a great number of their businesses are led by, you know, homegrown Germans.
Yeah.
I think, you know, if you look at the big car makers, you look at the banks, the airlines, they're all homegrown leaders. I think if you were to say, let's bring in somebody from the UK who speaks fluent German to run Volkswagen or to run Allianz, that would be a big deal in the media and in society. And, you know, it was a woman, I think it would be even more difficult for them to cope with. Because if you look at the way that Angela Merkel was treated during her time, and when she left Germany, you know, she was a pariah in the end for all of the things she did or didn't do. So I think, you know, if you look across Europe, some countries are comfortable with international leaders coming into their businesses, whereas others, maybe like Germany, they still have to move on.
How does that impact a role like yours when you're looking at kind of the leadership team and how it's made up and maybe even how it's questioned then, whether it's an outsider coming in or that kind of homogenous leadership team?
Yeah, don't get me wrong. You know, if you come into Switzerland as a leader from a another country and you don't learn the language and you don't integrate, then they will, the media particularly will take a dim view. But also there's an etiquette. There's an old style conservative etiquette in business here where it is all about the network. It's a bit like us. We've known each other for 30 years and we've kept in touch. Switzerland, to a certain extent, is a bit like Scotland, where it's all about those networks. And here in this country, it's about the army, because you have to serve in the army as a reservist by law. So that network is the army network. So all of those people in there, help each other out. And there's an etiquette that you have to learn, and some nuances and behaviours. When you go to someone's house, after 10 o'clock at night, you don't flush the toilet. It's a kind of 1950s style approach to etiquette with people in Switzerland, particularly on the German side. It's a bit different on the French side.
There's a bit of trivia I'm going to take away from this. I'll try not to offend anybody if I go there. And also learning the language, I get it. I'm still trying to learn Australian. And it is not as easy as it seems, I'll tell you.
It's true.
Yeah, something like that. That's about it. Now I'm curious. You worked at the BBC, at ITN, at Sky, very creative parts. You were involved with broadcasting from a very young age. I'm curious how going from that very creative, very kind of doing it in the moment a large part of the time, just to the very structured environment. How's that been for you?
Yeah. So if you think that I was 15 when I did my first broadcast on BBC One on Final Score, and nobody at the BBC knew I was still at school. I was at Boroughmuir in Edinburgh, and I was in detention. And the deputy head teacher, Margaret Merriman, she said to me, "Oh, what are you doing at the weekend?" I said, "Rangers Hearts at Ibrox." And she just looked at me and she went, "No, come on, Neil, get a grip of yourself, son," like my dad used to say. So in hindsight, if I could rewind the clock back, would I have wanted to start doing that at that age now? And actually, maybe not, because I really should have taken time to learn my craft. And I was thrown in at the deep end. So I did those reports 30 seconds on a Saturday. And then they got me to do my first television commentary age 16 in 1992. And again, it's kind of, looking back, would I have wanted my daughter to do that at that age? Because it's obviously a different culture now with TikTok and YouTube and video. But what that set me up for was being able to be kind of resilient going forward. Because, you were going into press boxes and rooms with men in their 40s and 50s who had taken the hard knocks from Alex Ferguson, Jock Stein, legends of football. They were held up. Some of them were held up against the wall and threatened, by certain managers.
No names.
But also, to go through all of that, and then to go to Scott FM, where I was going to Ibrox and interviewing the late great Walter Smith and the late great Tommy Burns. Walter Smith was fierce. He was absolutely. He scared me to death. Every Friday I would go in there and he would just give me that steely Glaswegian look, and if I asked a difficult question, because, nobody said to me, you've got to be really you've got to build up to the big question. So what that set me up for was dealing with really tough leaders in journalism. Some of the news editors at the BBC and Sky were fierce. They were monstrous, some of them. And then moving into comms with, chief executives, how do you deal with really complex, hardball corporate leaders? And nobody, you can't be taught that. It's not a McKinsey thing. It's not, you don't go to university and get taught how to deal with a fierce Scouser running Nintendo's marketing, who good was never good enough. And how do you navigate that? And how do you use your language and your diplomacy skills to work with so many different nationalities and personalities. And that all comes from that grassroots, because, if I'd not done all of that football reporting and television stuff, I may not have had that resilience to take me through a 18-year comms career where, one of my chief execs in one of the corporates was like a mafioso. He was hardball. One mistake and you were out. And people used to say you're only as good as your last broadcast, and in some respects you're only as good as your last press release, or you're only as good as your last piece in the FT that was really, really good. So it's a lesson to broadcasters and communications people now that it is a school of hard knocks, and actually, because commercial radio is networked now and hospital radio is dying, there's not really the places to practice your craft and make your mistakes. So now it's kind of sink or swim, and that's quite upsetting, because you don't have the grounding to be able to make your mistakes quietly.
So you see that as a loss to people's development?
Yeah, I do, and it's a worldwide phenomenon. People are doing podcasts now, but if you think of podcasts, they're live, they're on the web, they're there for life. So if you make a mistake or it doesn't sound as good, you're judged on that. Whereas hospital radio, community radio, you can make a ton of mistakes, no one would really hear it, but you would get the 10,000 hours of experience that you need to be the new Roger Federer, or to be the Beyonce, if you want to be. So that's the challenge now, I think.
It's interesting, actually, because I think this is the first year that Gen Z is now becoming more in the workplace than boomers. So we're going to see a big shift there. We're also seeing a lot of Gen Z actually not wanting responsibility. Now, I know I'm generalizing, and it's not good to do that, but it's good to understand trends. And they're kind of making that choice of like, I don't want to do middle management. I want to kind of jump from here to senior or nothing. So we are kind of beginning to see that. I think that's going to play out over the next 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, and there's a real, people are already fatigued by the AI phenomenon. And, if you look at LinkedIn now, 65% of posts are generated by AI. And you can see the little emojis, which is, pretty clear. And some of the language, nevertheless, moreover, furthermore, coming into the thing. So, when people say AI is going to kill lots of jobs, it'll change lots of jobs. But, if you try and do an AI video edit, or you try and, do some AI scripts for a TV drama, you're going to lose all of that passion and inspiration. And I think people are getting to that point where, yes, use ChatGPT to write an email, or write a missive from a senior exec, but it's not going to be the crutch that we're going to be using going forward. And I was at my daughter's school the other day, and they're already changing the way that exams are done. So the kids can't use AI. They've got to actually learn. They've got to learn in a different way in the classroom. So it's an interesting. It's a phenomenon that will change things, but not in the dramatic way that people think.
Yeah, I think and what we've seen is the kind of the use of AI is at a very basic level. People are kind of looking at just to almost cheat on a LinkedIn post or something like that. Just make it. I think the DeepSeek and the Alibaba release just over the last couple of weeks that's probably the biggest game changer that we've seen so far in it since ChatGPT came out. I'm curious, where do you see this? Is it an opportunity for comms? Is it a threat for companies? How do you see it?
I think when it comes to press releases, I was receiving press releases in the 1990s, and to a certain extent they're the same as they are today. So the press release has not evolved. And some people might say, well, is there a need for press releases? Well, if you're reporting financial results, there's a regulatory reason why you have to issue a press release. Whereas I think it's got to go back to being about relationships with journalists and knowing what a story is and what appeals to them. Because I think if businesses assume that AI can do the job of a communications team, well, can AI say to a really difficult journalist in Switzerland or London, well, that story is wrong, I'd suggest you change X, Y, and Z. Well, that's not going to come from that. But if I sit and put into ChatGPT all of the figures, a quote from a chief exec, and the FDA, and forward-looking statement, disclaimer, I can probably get something that's 80% close to what we would handwrite or we would type. So that's the part of the job that is kind of quarterly or once in a while. But I think the whole going into a room and influencing people, helping people with change management, going out and talking to a politician, that's still a human act. That even if you're 14 now and you go into work when you're 19, you're still going to be doing those people interactions going forward. So people interactions in the sense of what we do will still happen. Going and ordering a burger in a drive-in might all be AI. So I think that using language and picking up the phone and doing interviews like this will still be hugely important, to the corporate world.
You mentioned kind of things being created. I'm curious. I was reading the other day about deepfakes. Stuff being kind of created that's false narrative, but voice recognition and voice replication is becoming really good. And some of it, we know it at the moment, but we know the technology's changing. How would you handle it if your CEO was hit with like a deepfake scandal or something like that? There was something released that was just not true.
Yeah, it's really difficult because we, in one of the companies I worked in, we actually did a deepfake of the chief exec, and we played it to a room of about 500 people. A lot of them communicators, and they're like, "Oh yeah, it's him." But when we put the volume up, he was speaking in German. Now they all know he doesn't speak German, so that's how they knew that it wasn't him. But they thought that the physical deepfake was him until we faded up the sound. I think the challenges are when you are a regulated financial business on a stock market and you're doing results and you do a video with the chief exec that goes on the website or for Bloomberg, pre-recorded with Bloomberg, and then, some rogue rival or rogue state produces the same video, but slags off the numbers or the shareholders or whatever, and puts that out on a network. It could be LinkedIn. There's no checks and balances on LinkedIn. You can put a video up, and with the algorithm, with my algorithm, with your algorithm, it can be seen by 100,000 people very, very quickly. So the short answer is, when I spoke to our legal team in that highly regulated business, they said, we have a queue of complaints going back 7 months that are not being addressed. So you imagine trying to get that video that I've just talked about taken down within hours. It's just not going to happen. And if you look at the way Facebook's behaving with the not challenging far right posts and videos, if that video went on to Facebook, would it ever be taken down? So if you're a business that's going through change management or closing a factory, and a fake video goes up and says, "Oh, you're all going to lose your jobs and you're not going to get any compensation for that," well, that's going to create a huge issue. So if you remember some of the strikes of the 1980s miners' strikes, the Wapping strike. Imagine if someone did a fake video of Rupert Murdoch and put that onto social media today when there was a strike at Wapping for the print workers. I mean, there would have been civil unrest. So I think that's the challenge. It's one, it can be made in 2 seconds. 2, it can be put up on LinkedIn in a few seconds. And 3, it's going to take you months to get it taken down. And that's the dangerous thing. And then when you add into that misinformation and disinformation, so when people go onto Twitter and say that, you have the anti-COVID vaccines people, but you also have people who are spreading rumors from rogue states of contact lenses that are going to burn your eyes out, and one of those manufacturers had to take those off the market as a precaution, but there's nothing wrong with the contact lenses. It was just they were so worried about the misinformation, and there's no control over that. And I remember Richard Quest of CNN, I went to speak to him in 2008 about Twitter. And the first thing he said was, it's like dynamite going off in your hand. This is dangerous stuff, Twitter. And that was then. Imagine what he would say now. I mean, it's just uncontrollable.
Richard Quest. So you've actually gone and spoken to him, and I said hi to him on a crossing in New York once. That's the closest I've got to him.
Yeah.
So when's there been a time? There's got to have been a time in the last kind of 15 years where you've gone, oh damn, this is not good. This is really not good. Is there any time you can tell us?
Yeah, I think it's when you get the call from, let's say, the FT, and the FT say to you, we've been to speak to this source, and this source has told us that you have stopped something happening that's going to have a material impact on your share price. And no one in the company knew that this thing had stopped happening, okay? So this journalist had 95% of the story written, and she just needed a response from us. And it was the Friday afternoon phone call that you dread, because you get those often from journalists who they don't want to give you the time to think about it. And if it's on a weekend, no one's around to respond. So we got everyone round on a call. And I was sitting outside my daughter's drama club on a Saturday in Zurich, dealing with this issue, and everybody was on the call. And the consensus was, let's not respond. And I'm like, but hang on a minute, we need to see the sketch of what she's written, and then respond to those points that are not true. Because in a statement, and this is the thing about statements, some companies will send out 5 paragraphs of a statement. No journalist will ever use that. So in the 60 to 80 words that you've got to encapsulate your response. So we spent time on that. We had about a week to, in the end, to do it. We went back, it went in. But this was one of 3 articles. So it wasn't the one and done, as we would say. It was 3. And those are the times when you kind of suck in your teeth and go, well, what can we as comms do about it? What can anyone do about it when you've spoken to a credible source who has just sat there over 2 pints in a pub somewhere in the UK and said, well, this is what's happened, and these are the consequences. I think the other thing is when you have a product recall, but it's a product recall when there was a football tournament on, and we'd sent out a considerable number of plastic beer barrels, 5-litre plastic beer barrels, and in the heat they were exploding. So we got a call from someone in Paisley, near Glasgow, who said, this beer barrel has exploded over me and my entire family. all of them soaked in this very famous beer. And luckily, his football team were sponsored by this beer company, and he managed to have a visit to the football club he supported with his entire family as a result. But so we managed to recall the beer, but we'd also sent out a considerable number to journalists. So I had to go around the whole of the southeast of England and meet couriers and stop them getting to the doors of very senior television business journalists, and replaced it with a case of this beer rather than the exploding beer barrel.
So you chased trucks around the southeast of England to collect beer?
Yeah, from journalists before they got to the journalist door. Yeah.
Worst jobs. When you're thinking about responding to when journalists give you that Friday afternoon call, I assume having been on the broadcast side helps you kind of strategize behind that?
Yeah, there's two ways you do it. There's the easy way, which is, we're not prepared to comment on rumors or speculation, which is pretty standard when you're dealing with a listed company that's on in some cases, two stock markets. It's home stock market and then the New York or London stock exchange. The second piece is crafting a statement with legal and compliance and regulatory involved to address the points. We didn't do that. This is incorrect. Safety is our top priority. It sounds, some of the statements sound like a bit of a cliche, but when legal are involved in compliance, you have to stick with what is possible at the time.
I suppose it's a really difficult balance. So you hear it with football clubs when they transfer, they're linked with all these players and say, well, either confirm it or deny it. And if you did that, you'd be doing that with every single rumor. So you can't respond to it.
Yeah, and if you look at clickbait today, 90% of clickbait, particularly in tabloid newspapers like the Mirror in the UK with football stories, it draws you in. It's Marcus Radford has done a terrible thing, and then you get into the story and he's kind of left the door open in his car, or Marcus Radford considers his future at Manchester United, but there's nothing in the body of that story. So when you have those things, it would be an industry. You would have to have a team of 50 people a day going out and rebutting stories. So that is the challenge. What is real and what's made up. And we'll eventually get to the stage where you can't really pick up any of those red tops anymore and believe anything, because it's just all to click through to an advert or a website.
So when you've got something credible, is it better to get stuck right into it and get it answered as quickly as possible, or kind of hold the position, keep quiet?
I think you take your time. I mean, you find out the deadline. Television and radio is a bit more difficult, because if it's immediate, Sky News or 5 Live or Fox, Fox in Australia, Sky News Australia, they'll want an immediate, and sometimes it's just a holding position. If you've had an air disaster or a rail disaster, then those guys will want the news quickly. And sometimes, police forces will take a little bit longer because they want to see the full picture. And that's old school comms.
So that's when you can control it. What happens when the microphone's put in front of a CEO or, just one of the SLT within the business, and you can't control it? I know you do media training. How do you... we've done stuff online. You've done a lot more than I have. But I still know that when you're put in that position, it's not easy to gather your thoughts quickly.
Yeah, I mean, the chief exec of BP, when he said, I want to get back to my life after the biggest oil disaster in recent memory, he was advised to within an inch of his life. by comms people who I know. But the difficulty is that he'd been down there for like 39 days straight, and he just had enough. He'd had enough of probably seeing the pain of the local people who'd lost their livelihoods because of this huge oil killing, the fishing industry down there. So I think that's really difficult to police. I mean, companies often don't say sorry quickly enough. And sorry, or we apologize, we're going to fix this, is something that we've seen from Boeing recently with the plane problems, and obviously the disasters that came with those Air Max planes. But it took them a long time to get there. There's a number of examples where the style of the sorry or the tone of the sorry isn't good enough, and that creates a bigger story. So I think that if a CEO comes out of a building and you've got the world's press there, then don't let them out of the building until they've got their position and they've got something to say. And I always say to politicians, executives, naughty footballers, if you're walking along the street and a journalist is filming you and interviewing you, just keep walking and don't talk, because the worst thing you can do is walk and talk, because that's when you make the biggest mistakes.
Interesting. You think the press will always need to have a villain? They'll always have to have that.
Yes.
The BP, huge disaster, but managed to kind of nail it onto one name.
Yeah, I think peril. Let's use the word peril, and in certain languages, there's no translation of peril into certain other languages. But if you look at the Daily Mail and a lot of those newspapers, peril, it's the worst tornado in the UK since records began. It's always since records began. But actually, the next day it's just a bit of wind. I mean, the last one was obviously a big one, and sadly it caused a lot of damage, and a few people lost their lives. But normally, if there's chaos or peril or a storm, or a villain. So if you look at how easy it is now for someone to make a comment on Twitter, and then it suddenly becomes a Twitter storm. And the villain can sell papers and sell clicks. I mean, if you look at the Greg Wallace MasterChef issue recently, it's very easy for the newspapers to drive that story and keep it alive for, that ran for 2.5 weeks. And Greg Wallace was in the paper and on TV almost every day. And rightly or wrongly, in the 1990s, with all that was going on, that would have been a nib on page 12. Yes. But now it's the biggest thing, and whatever he said or whatever he did, I'm not making excuses for him, but they do make peril is certainly something that drives clicks.
Yeah, but you and I are old enough to remember when storms didn't have names. Remember, it was just a breeze.
It's a storm. Yeah.
It's a storm, and that was it.
Yeah.
I've got to tell. I mean, I've got to mention this. I've just written this down. I'd forgotten. Just not long before I met you, one of my first jobs was with a company called Ratner's.
Yes.
And I remember the reputation of Gerald Ratner within the business was phenomenal. He was regarded so highly by everyone, every brand new store manager. And I'll put a link into the story of Ratner, so we don't need to go into it. I'll put a link into the comments. But he was regarded so highly. Every new store manager flew down to London to have a bit of an audience with them, and maybe a sandwich and a cup of tea, and he was just regarded so highly. And then he made one incredibly ill-judged joke. It has to be said that I think it was the IOD, And then all of a sudden, a whole business comes down when he kind of badmouths his own product. So it's not just kind of now; it's littered with it.
Yeah, and we say to people that stand up on stage or go to dinners or whatever, don't do jokes, because a joke that's acceptable to 60% of the room won't be acceptable to the other 40%, or they just won't understand it. A lot of nationalities don't get irony; they don't get the British sense of humour.
Absolutely.
So it's something that just keep it straight, because you can lose share price with an off the cuff comment.
So we talked about SEO. What about internal comms? We've got Slack channels, we've got WhatsApps and all that kind of stuff, which are supposed to be private, but people let their guard down. We all get complacent. Do you get involved with that, about giving kind of even guidelines, and how do you make sure that nothing comes out from an internal comms position?
It is very difficult, because once that press release goes up internally, or once you send out a missive on email, there are, if it's an industrial relations issue where we're closing a facility or people are losing their jobs, then that private communication internally will become external. There's message boards, there's forums, people go on LinkedIn. In some companies, they will censor negative comments from disgruntled whistleblowers or employees, whereas in some companies I've worked, they've just let the comments write because they didn't want to be seen to be censoring them. But when you have disgruntled employees on a grand scale, then they feed each other, on LinkedIn particularly. And people talk about Facebook and Twitter, but if you look at LinkedIn, the algorithm works in mysterious ways. So if you make a comment on a chief exec's public profile, then that can be seen around the world by hundreds of thousands of people. So internal comms is never really internal, but when we write internal comms emails for leaders, we want it to be in plain, accessible language, because I think if you look at the way that certain things are written these days, even before ChatGPT, it was all in flowery, McKinsey-style language, and people just look at that and they just don't believe it, and it's not accessible to them. So if you're communicating in English in a company where you're surrounded by 52 nationalities, you have to make sure that people can understand in English what it actually means.
I think it was Dell that had to switch off some of the internal communications and message boards when they did the kind of the return to office just before, towards the end of last year, I think it was. They gave everybody 5 days notice to come back in full time.
Yeah, it's dangerous. Because
sorry, one minute.
No, I can't.
I'm looking forward. What do you think is going to happen, say, in the next 12, 18 months that nobody's either preparing for or kind of prepared to admit that this is a real potential crisis?
I think because there's been such a shake-up in the White House, and there's been, Europe is moving right in terms of politics. I think there's going to be a lot more challenges for people who want to come and work in certain countries, for economic migrants, for example. I think it's going to be tougher for people to come from certain countries to Europe or Asia or the US, because politically, if you look at newspapers, social channels, Facebook, Twitter, there's a lot of rhetoric about, well, let's give jobs to our own people, let's spend money on our own people who need help. And we're seeing that in the US. We're certainly seeing it in the UK. The last election was fought on stopping the boats. stopping the immigrants. So, we have seen pockets of this over the last decade with the rise of certain parties. But if you look at the polls in the UK now, Reform are neck and neck with Labour, the incumbent. And that suggests that a mood is changing in a direction where people are. We're going to be less of a multinational focused continent. So let's use Europe as an example. Germany has obviously got deep economic problems, and they're starting to look at their policies on immigration. I mean, some of the borders here are being closed. We're in Schengen, but Austria, Germany, and Switzerland, to a certain extent, have been closing their borders, which has never really been the case since COVID. In the case of the Schengen Agreement. So what it's doing is I think that appetite to be an expat, or the ability to be an expat, is being restricted by political manoeuvring and the mood of certain factions in countries. And that's quite sad, because we value the huge number of international people that come into various countries, and they bring variety, and they bring economic strength. So there's obviously that part. But secondly, I think there's a real challenge with what's true and what's not, in the various different channels, and how algorithms are influencing what maybe your children see on TikTok. If when we talk about peril, we talk about anxiety, well, TikTok will fix the algorithm on what is really causing the most distress to your child or young person. So that's going to be a big, when people talk about the explosion of mental health issues, well, some of that is to do with what people are seeing on videos and what they're consuming on a grand scale.
I find it strange. We're dealing with global companies on a daily basis, and every company that I know of is under-resourced, and yet we close off borders to kind of to stop that from happening. Let's talk about final couple of things, Neil. I really appreciate your time. So just a couple of things, going back to that time when we were just kind of starting out. What traits do you believe somebody kind of needs to be able to develop themselves? What traits were kind of useful for you, or kind of a driver for you? I mean, you mentioned resilience already.
Yeah.
What was?
Yeah, I think networking, and having that ability not to take no for an answer, was instilled very early on. Now, bear in mind that this was pre-email, so I was sending typed letters with tapes to various people all over the UK to try and get a job. So it was that determination, but also pick up the phone. I mean, we rely so much on email and LinkedIn messages and whatever, but picking up the phone to someone, or sending them a letter, is really effective. So I see on LinkedIn how a lot of people are struggling to get jobs through the algorithms on LinkedIn. I did recommend we'll send the hiring manager a letter, because all the letters we get, you get a Christmas card once a year, or you get an invoice every now and again, but you just don't get physical letters anymore. Yeah. So if someone sent me a CV and a nice letter, I'd probably ring them up and get them in. Because I think we have to go back to basics, some of those basics in those days. And if you ring someone up, sometimes they've maybe not spoken to anyone on the phone all day, or for a whole week. So it's refreshing.
There was a certain naiveness, wasn't there? And it's good to be naive at times.
Yeah. That you could ring up. I mean, I used to ring up very famous Scottish journalists on a Sunday night just to have a chat, age 16. And, to give you an example, Alistair Alexander, who was a late, great famous Scottish commentator, would always take the call and just sit and have a chat, about football or whatever. People don't do that enough. It's all WhatsApp, but you could ring people on their home phone, and just have a chat, which we don't do anymore.
I think you and I are probably similar, that I met all my heroes, if we want to call heroes, when I was very young, and I just felt that I had access to them. So kind of not being overawed to any great extent, which is good. Which is good. Final question. We always ask this. What's a challenge that you kind of set others to do things differently? Just give you an idea. In fact, we had Russell on the other week, Russell Dalglish, and he set a very big challenge of just connecting with the biggest people you could find on LinkedIn, and just keep on connecting with them. But Terry Hamill set it down about getting into rooms you're going to be uncomfortable in, the ones where you feel you probably shouldn't be, but just get into them all the same. What's a challenge that you would put down to others to maybe be able to think differently, or something that would be a bit of a stretch for them?
Yeah, I think it's today looking at multiple sources of information and news. I think sometimes people are stuck on their favorite channel. Some might read The Guardian, but they don't read the Daily Mail, they don't read the FT, they don't read the Sun, they don't read the Sydney Morning Herald or the Australian. I think it's really important when you've got apps on your phone that can take you to the New York Times, or can take you to the Guardian, or can take you to BBC, to see that big picture. Because I was talking to my daughter last night, and she said, since Trump's come to power, there's been 20 plane crashes in the US. I said, no, I would have heard about that, and we know of 2. But because sometimes you're looking at TikTok only, there's obviously conspiracy theories and whatever. So I think in the workplace, use multiple sources as well, because sometimes people will send you in a direction that is not the one that you should be going in, and whether it's deliberate or whether it's malicious, always go and listen to various opinions before you make that final decision, because sometimes that's not done. It's all done on email, and when you get to the conclusion of what you want to do, it might be the wrong thing.
Good advice. Neil Henderson, you're an absolute star. Been fantastic to speak to you again.
Thank you.
Hopefully we can do it again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.